Hello everyone, welcome to this EPG Pathshala. This lecture is on culture, domination and communication. This lecture is a part of your paper on media, culture and society. In this lecture, we will discuss culture as a form of domination and communication. The idea of culture as domination is well illustrated by scholars from the Frankfurt School. However, their interest of articulating domination of culture is in the context of massification and commodification of culture. Scholars from Frankfurt School critique the advanced and industrialized mode organizing production of culture with a sense of loss of authenticity and aesthetics of culture. This lecture intends to go beyond such conceptualization and locating culture and domination in everyday life. The presentation is divided in 3 parts. In the first part, we will discuss the idea of culture as communicational. This theorization leads us to further investigations on culture and cultural confrontations. The second section deals with how culture has been a site of confrontation. To substantiate this, the third section will discuss the categorization of highbrow and popular culture, because this signifies a terrain of dominance where the popular is differentiated from highbrow culture on the grounds that secure dominance for the highbrow culture. Before going further, let us discuss the learning outcomes first. During this lecture, you will be learning that culture as a site of confrontation did not emerge only with the emergence of mass culture, as the impression we draw from the theories of cultural encoding. Historically, with the emergence of class societies, it has happened that culture has always been a site of contestation. This lecture will guide you to the idea of culture as communicational. This way you will learn that both culture and communication are the two sides of the same coin and open for contestation. Hence, you will learn that the role of culture as communicational is not in its capacity to create cohesiveness but generate conflicts. The attempt of taking popular away from mass culture to people will help you to testify these arguments in the light of concrete examples. So, let us start with the first part, culture as communicational. Culture is not a substantive concept. This means that it cannot be seen in terms of fixed binaries of literate and illiterate, elite and popular, dominant and subaltern, and so on. Such dichotomous concepts characterizing the distinctive markers of cultural worlds standing apart from one another are considered as unwarranted. These oppositional classifications of culture are delusive and essentialist in nature. Culture is rather seen as a dialectical category to be apprehended as a field of contending forces, a milieu of exchange, encounter, confrontation, and possibly conflict. And for such an exchange, encounter, confrontation, and conflict to take place, communication is indispensable. Hence, culture is essentially of a communicational nature, as argued by the editors of Communication, Culture, and Confrontation, Bell et al., who cited this in 2010. Where an attempt is made to construct a sketch of cultural perspectives to understand communication processes in India. This meaning of culture takes inspiration from the founder of American cultural studies, James Carey, who also defines culture as communication. For Carey, culture and communication are reciprocal concepts. Following this line of inquiry, Guy Poitevin regards communication as cultural process is a concept altogether different from communication as a pattern of interaction or system of symbolic exchange. So, the key of symbolic innovation is interactivity and interbreeding. This meaning of culture as communication allocates a dynamic role to understand the concept. In such conceptualization, people are not cultural dopes or passive receivers. They are engaged actively in the process of creation of culture and also challenging and changing the existing cultural forms of dominance. Culture may be attributed as communicational for the two important elements, that is consensus and conflict. First, culture is instrumental in offering a symbolic meaning of social binding to a small local community or large regional entity. In this way, cultures perform viable collectives. Rifts, dissent, breach of consensus, and alternative or deviant practices are always present that prevents the maintenance of cohesiveness, according to Bell et al. In the year 2010. When it is said that cultures perform collectives, we refer to the idea of an identity and a sense of belongingness to human beings, which implies a power of culture. Culture is able to create the sense of belongingness to a community, a class, or a group. And this way, culture generates a communicative efficiency. This gives each cultural form the status of a symbolic device binding people. Culture is communicational in the sense that the communicative efficiency of a cultural form is what distinguishes a cultural form as performative of a collective from a means of communication which is nothing more than a carrier of information. Again, this was stated by Bell et al. In the year 2010. Hence, the relevance of culture lies in its effective strategy of providing a collective identity to any group or community. And the identity of a group keeps negotiating with the past for its status in present. Therefore, two drives are constitutive of collective identities, that is negotiation and heterogeneity. 7 levels of cultural forms of expression and communication have been identified for analytical purpose. These 7 cultural forms of expression and communication exemplify the idea of culture as communicational, for there are strategies of communicative interaction. We will now discuss these 7 cultural expressions of communicative interaction as outlined by the editors of Communication, Culture and Confrontation. First is practical know-how, occupational skill such as birthing practices, handicraft and farming methods. Second is physical forms, material culture such as artifacts, traditions of performing arts, customs and lifestyles. Then networks of relation, links and interactions binding individuals into particular social configurations, such as a body of laws applied in a given community or at a given period in the life of that community. Next is representations, mental forms and immaterial images associated with various kinds of practices. Fifth is rituals and symbolic conducts corresponding to the previous levels. Next is narratives and discourses that carry theoretical and ideological framework and account for the different types of conducts, systems of social regulations, legal codifications and jurisprudence. And lastly, means of preservation, transmission and circulation, such as songs, proverbs and sayings that specifically encapsulate and carry knowledge. It is argued that all these cultural forms act in unison as communication vehicles. Each of them build and maintain cohesive collectives in its specific capacity, binding individuals into distinct communities and various communities into an integrated social fabric. This way of looking at culture as communicational, maintaining the cohesive collectives and binding individuals suggests a complex model with regard to the processes of culture, substantively construed as a matter of communicational transitivity against all essentialist approaches. This fact was brought out by Bell et al. In 2010. Coming to culture, communication and conflict. Culture does not always secure or provide consensus. It is equally important to understand what happens when there is a breach of consensus, or to put it in another way, the breach of consensus, dissents and defiance are integral to cultural practices. This breaks the homogeneity and hegemony of the dominant. Hence, the cohesiveness is never secured with permanency. This is how culture emerges as a field of contending forces. The emergence of countercultures testifies the emergence of repressed voices against the established norms, codes or values. Countercultures may arise in any field of music, literature, festivals, philosophy, performing arts, codes of conduct, norms, values, legal systems, ethics, day-to-day behavior and lifestyle. Hence, culture proves to be a matter of politics, as a confrontation of claims to different projects of sociality. It is a matter of politics because the irreconcilable visions of antagonistic poles such as elite and popular, dominant and subaltern, do not exist but are construed out of a will to create a cultural hegemony on the part of those in a position of domination. The domination or superiority is claimed on the strength of monologically authoritative interpretations. Again, this was stated by Bell et al. In 2010. In this backdrop, culture is a two-way transitive process of interaction or negotiation. It does not exist as a fixed monolithic category to be deconstructed by someone. In Marxist sense, it will be called a dialectical process where the contradiction always plays out for the construction of something new. Such transactions between contesting world views do not always take place out of spontaneous needs or free will to reappropriate and own a heritage. They may well be enforced out of a will to dominate and control. In both cases, spontaneous needs and enforcement of a will to dominate, there takes place a confrontation which may be sometimes peaceful or violent. Let us now come to the second part of the presentation: culture, communication and confrontation. Our discussion till now establishes the idea that culture is a category of constant confrontation, contention, reinterpretation, manipulation, appropriation, imposition, ascendancy, repetition, enforcement, refusal, denial, reappraisal and encounter are some of the processes of culture as confrontation. Once we go beyond the communicational efficiency through which the cultural forms are instrumentalized to shape a social fabric, the question of conflicting stakes and power enter into the picture. This is again stated by Bell et al. In the year 2010. One should not confuse cultural differences with cultural confrontations. It is said that cultural violence is not born by cultural differences. It is carried out by a will to social discrimination by particular social agents. Social or political clashes in the name of culture are actually to be predicted upon by a sheer want of culture. They stage social figures of communication that are directly the reverse of any genuine cultural encounter as we figure it out. They actually are its antinomy because they are prompted by a denial of interbreeding through sustained and fruitful communication of idioms. Therefore, when we speak of cultural encounters, it is by no means be confused with clash of civilizations, but with a will to dominate and discriminate. From a communicational point of view, the fundamental way in which power expresses itself is in its capability to define, allocate and display reality. For this, power gets constructed in expressive forms such as cultural artifacts and communicative practices. It is then shared by others in the society. This communicational view of culture can be seen as an extension of the argument that the reality which is set before us is actually a construction of the dominant culture to make itself appear as natural. Therefore, reality is actually not real, but an inversion of what should have actually been the reality. That is, an egalitarian culture where there is no cultural discrimination, where no one is privileged for belonging to upper caste, and no one is discriminating for being a Dalit or a tribal or a minority. It is argued that the moment we question the binary of the highbrow and popular culture, we enter into the terrain of cultural struggle. The use of the term popular cultures is seen as highly problematic. The editors of the book Communication, Culture and Confrontation raise a fundamental question. Should the people be really equated to the popular? By raising this question, they are actually taking the field of popular culture away from mass culture. According to them, the popular should be understood not as debased mass culture, but as authentic and free forms of culture emanating from the people. Here, popular is not seen as debased commercial culture or mass culture. The popular culture stands here against dominant elite culture or a repressive ruling class culture. Further, they argue that the cultural struggle should be understood in terms of the contestation over the symbolic systems that give meaning to human experience and cohesion, to human collectives. Popular culture can be better understood as a field of conflicting claims, an area of social assets available to competing social agencies. Therefore, in this arena of popular culture, what is at stake is the domination. In such a contestation, the very division between popular and highbrow culture is an attempt on the part of political and cultural elite to manage their dominance. These elites have the capacity to manage the intellectual resources of society. As Armand Metelart, in his book How to Read Donald Duck, writes, in a society where one class controls the means of economic production, that class also controls the means of intellectual production, ideas, feelings, institutions, in short, the very meaning of life. And in this process of managing the intellectual resources of society, people's cultural traditions are transcribed, classified and preserved. Popular culture is seen as the other of the mainstream culture. It is never considered as people's meaningful practices of effective existence. In common parlance, we oppose popular culture to elitist culture. This dichotomy is arbitrary and misleading. Such classificatory category is coined by circles that identify themselves through force as elite over the others simply by discriminating on their own authority upon what they consider as not belonging to their fold. They secure legitimacy for this statement by an effect of discourse that makes sense for both parties with reference to a hierarchical framework, which is taken for granted. These circles differentiate themselves from by discriminating themselves against the rest of the others. The distinction rests upon the value judgment enforced for reasons of social cultural dominance. This process pushes the popular into the realm of aestheticization and idealization, according to Poitevin in the year 2010. Idealization and aestheticization are the processes that exorcise the counter-cultural spirit of the popular. Hence, these are inseparable from processes of suppression. But the opposition of popular to classical is to be construed as a social event through which the representatives of the classical advocate and appropriate for themselves a right of control in cultural matters. Hence, culture becomes a site through which groups compete for supremacy. The dichotomy of classical versus popular is ideological, according to Poitevin in the year 2010. Poitevin, borrowing from Stuart Hall's essays, Notes on Deconstructing the Popular Culture, Notes on Deconstructing the Popular, argues that we need to rescue popular from being museumized for the aesthetical consumption of the political and cultural elites. We need to look at popular as versatile voices and practices of vast majority of people. The popular becomes a site of interest when its dangers are eliminated or its magnificence is displayed as a dream of wonder in the past, according to Poitevin in 2010. By way of this, its historical substance has been subdued or converted into something else, by someone else, for something else. Popular cultures existed among the learned discourses of cultural elites in a mode of alienation. Poitevin brings popular back as the living consciousness of people themselves from the enthusiastic glorification. According to him, this task of bringing popular to people is itself a political act. Only a political act questioned the established patterns of power sharing, lay the foundations of new articulations of science and knowledge, reverse the dynamics of cultural repression, and create the conditions of the possibility of a general democratic communication of knowledge. While pointing out to the processes of domination supporting the superiority of written over verbal, Poitevin emphasizes that the oral and written should not be observed as separate and opposite extremes. In any given context, their attributes and functions are determined by the capacity and will of the partners of that system of relations to avail of them to serve their ends. This is illustrated by the fact that before the introduction of printing technology, the oral culture retained its absolute predominance. It transformed everything that came close to it. Similarly, after the invention of printing, democratization occurred to a certain extent in the transmission of knowledge. Although printed word established its own hierarchy and suppressed the oral cultures, however, we see a paradox that exemplifies the consequences of printing for the people. On one hand, it can break the traditional monopolies of knowledge and authority, widely circulate and sell information or works of imagination, according to Poitevin in 2010. By highlighting such paradoxes, the point that Poitevin is trying to prove is that people are not passive receivers or beneficiaries, not passive victims of the new means of communication. they prove to be the active users. Let us now try and summarize what we discussed in this lecture. In this lecture, we discussed that when culture is regarded as communicational, it highlights the role of culture in domination. The idea of culture as communicational breaks the binary opposition of classical and popular culture and argues that such categorization is essentially an attempt of cultural domination. The opposition between classical and popular is one classic example that testifies the cultural domination of political and cultural elite. Guy Potavin's ideas were discussed in detail to deconstruct the ideology of such oppositional classification. This is illustrated through the hierarchical opposition between writing and speech. Overall, when we distinguish the term popular culture from the mass culture and go deep into its analysis, the category of popular culture emerges as a form of discrimination to secure domination of cultural elite. Do attempt the questions in the self-evaluation quadrant, and for further reading suggestions, please refer to the third quadrant. Thank you.